record this, share the screen for the people at home. I want everybody to know that if you need to, for any reason, um, you can complete this class just as easy at home as you can here at school. Um, and so you'll be able to get your credit for your high school class. I do want to let you know that the final day to turn in any work is December 11th at midnight. That's the end of the semester. No work will be accepted after that date. So all the zeros will be permanent. So there's only a few of you that still have makeup work to do. Most of you are right on track. We'll have another study guide coming up next Monday. So plenty of time for those who need to catch up. And then we'll have a study guide on Monday that will incorporate from the last 3 lectures on Rome. And it'll include a few things about the election. I'm going to jump back here from the poli-sci lecture. We don't want to do all of this. We're not going to talk about politics so much, but we are going to talk about the outcome of the election and mention a few things on Veterans Day. Today is a very special day, Veterans Day, and it has to do with world history, okay? So we're going to go ahead and do a little bit of a presentation on this. Really special day for me. I of course, have family members in the military, and over the years, my dad was in World War II, my brother-in-law in Korean War, my son in the Air Force. So, the military is an important part of our lives. Um, okay, so let's talk about this Veterans Day. And I will have a couple of questions on the next study guide on Veterans Day because it hinges around an event in world history that's really important. It's called World War One. When World War One was being fought, it was called the Great War. There'd never been anything like it. Well, there'd been something similar to it. The American Civil War was the first war where really technology starts to win the day over, say, hand-to-hand combat. Like we talked about the Greeks and the Romans and their phalanx and their, hand-to-hand type stuff with spears and swords and the projectile weapons, arrows, very effective, um, catapults, that kind of thing. But when we get toward the Civil War, we have rifles able to hit a target 200 yards away. We see the first machine guns. They weren't used much, but they were figuring those out. Balloons were used to look over the battlefield, right? And then we had railways, rail tracks that could take heavy guns right to the battlefield, especially around Richmond, Virginia, at the conclusion of that war and just pound the city to pieces. And all this was new. We had ironclads, basically metal ships for the first time in the Civil War. We invented that. That was a feature of our invention during that war, which made all the other sailing ships obsolete. Every sailing ship in the world with sails and wood, even though they might have 40 guns on each side, one ironclad could take on an entire navy, which is really what happened on one day in the Civil War. So we see the mechanization, the industrialization of war. And that's the key thing I want you to remember here, the industrialization of war, where the Industrial Revolution was creating new ways, right, of fighting that was very different than anything in the medieval or ancient past. Well, this really hits its zenith in World War One. Some of the artillery pieces they made could hit targets 20 miles away. They had artillery that the Germans and the French and the British, and later, to a lesser extent, the Americans. But basically, German artillery was so effective that they could literally fire and hit every yard of the enemy line, the enemy trenches, hit every yard in a rolling fashion with literally, at one battle, 1,000,000 shells fired in one day. Tear up the landscape. Look at the picture here. This used to be a forest. This used to be farmland. This used to be beautiful country. And it was turned into nothing but dirt. And when it rained, it turned to mud. And the big holes that were created, craters, would fill with water and mud and turn into quicksand. They used a lot of horses in World War One, and they would get mired down and couldn't get out. and they couldn't pull them out. Men would get caught in there, in a place called Flanders, where it was just so terrible under the fighting conditions. So they used to build little wooden ramps, right, to get across the no man's land, as it was called. But these are terrible fighting conditions. And then about every fifth shell would be some sort of mustard gas or chemical agent, which meant they had to wear gas masks. And then they were in these trenches for days and days with shells coming in every direction. And it created a lot of psychological problems for a lot of the troops that were fighting this war. It was a terrible war. I think fighting in the trenches in World War I was probably the worst situation for a soldier ever created in war. Well, it was called the Great War. There was no world, it was not called World War I. If we're kind of looking back at history, it was probably we had 7 world wars, you could really say. The wars with Napoleon, right? The wars of conquest, the American Revolution turned into a world war involving France and Spain and Netherlands and England. And it was a worldwide conflict. And we were just a piece of that conflict. But this war was so horrible and so bad that people just assumed, well, humans are going to learn their lessons and we'll never repeat this. It was called the war to end all wars. 20 years later, we would fight a war that would be twice as deadly, where the technologies would be much better. So we go to World War I for today because America got involved in this war late. It was a world conflict. It started out innocently enough in the Balkans with an assassination of an Austrian archduke, like a vice president of their country. Things got out of hand in a hurry. And before you know it, the whole war was engulfed in a conflict that simply didn't have to be. And I wish we had more time to talk about how that started, but it was so minor an incident compared to what's going to happen. But all the sides were geared for war. They'd talked themselves into it for years. They had prepared battle plans. And so as soon as one little spark in Eastern Europe strikes the match, this whole powder keg of Europe blows up. And nobody could stop it. Now, the Germans were caught in the middle, right? They had to fight a 2-front war. So they had to fight Russia, and they also had to fight the French and the British. So they really had the toughest in terms of 2 fronts. But they still, even though their army was numerically smaller, they won so much against Russia that eventually Russia would have to pull out of the war. And they would sacrifice big chunks of Russia, areas they controlled, like Poland or Ukraine and Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, give it to the Germans to get out of the war. It was so desperate there. But when Russia pulls out of the war, Germany's able to move its troops from the east to the Western Front, which had been fought for the last 3.5 years in this area between France and Belgium. Right. So this means that the Germans have new life. Now, they're running out of supplies. They don't have a great food supply. Things are really rough on the German side, for sure. On the French and British side, though, they had American food and American supplies, even before we joined the war. We were called the great arsenal of democracy. So we basically were lending our industrial capacity to help one side, the democracies. And then when we finally had to go to war because of unrestricted German U-boat activity, sinking ships in the Atlantic, the President Wilson said, we're going to fight this war to make the world safe for democracy. Now let me pause for a second because I've got some noise coming in here. I need to, let me close that door. So what happens then is the United States jumps in, but we're late. The war's been going on for over 3 years. By the time we get to the front, we only fight for 6 months. But it was a key 6 months. It was an important 6 months. Because when we got there, the French, the British, and the Germans were all war weary. They were beaten up badly. They had suffered so many casualties. So when fresh American troops arrived, and there weren't many at first, 30, 40,000, we were landing 5,000 troops a day, big transport ships, 5,000 troops a day. But when the Germans got to the front with their new troops from Russia, they hit the line with everything they had and pushed almost to within capturing Paris. And if they did that, the French would pull out of the war and that would be over. The British would just have to cross the channel and leave. But luckily, there were enough American troops there to help out, and we stopped this advance. The Germans backed up a bit, regrouped, came again. By that time, though, we had about 250,000 American troops there. And so not only were we able to stop the advance, but we turned the corner on the war. So this front then becomes controlled by the American front, and we fought up to through the old lines where they'd been, fighting, within a few miles of each other for years. We burst through that with the French and British, and the Germans realized it was over. So the German High Command said, "All right, we're done. We want to quit fighting." Now, the treaty that ends the war is going to be negotiated later. It's called the Treaty of Paris. It was a terrible treaty, by the way, but that's a story for another day. To stop the fighting, German generals, French, British, American General Pershing met in a railroad car. That railroad car is still around. They met in this car and they signed what is called the armistice, the ending of hostilities. Now, they had to pick a time when they could communicate to all the armies across a 300-mile front when they should stop shooting at each other. So they picked 11-11-11. It's easy to remember. On the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour, stop fighting. They kept fighting right up until the last minute. Why? Maybe they could get a little piece of land here, stop an advance by the enemy there in order to have better bargaining position when the war ended at the Treaty of Paris. So the armistice, they fought right up to the last second. And it's a shame that people, were still dying right up to the last minute. Here's the New York Times headline: Armistice signed. End of the war. Berlin seized by revolutionists. New chancellor begs for order. Ousted Kaiser flees to Holland. They actually ran the leader of Germany out of Germany for signing this armistice or for agreeing to it. Now, here's the thing. This Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918, the pandemic has just begun. Anyway, it was the end of the fighting, became known as Veterans Day here in the United States. In most places, it's still called Armistice Day. World War I had been a massive slaughter. 50% of all troops involved were killed or captured or wounded or missing in action. 50%. If you went to the front, you had a 50-50 chance of making it back. While called the war to end all wars, we know that 20 years later, they're going to be right back at it. And it's going to be twice as bad as this one. Right. Well, what about these poppies? You notice this little picture here? A poppy is to remember. Throughout the British Empire, so if you go to Canada today, go to England today, they're wearing these little paper poppies. It's really cool. I mean, we're talking everybody. If you're on TV, if you're on a talk show, whatever, you got poppies on, everybody wearing's got poppies. What it is you buy these little poppies, and it's a fundraiser for veterans, essentially. But it's to remember this day, but also to remember all veterans, right? Everybody that served. So there was an incident of a poet. His name was John McCrae, who didn't make it to November 11/11. He instead passed away, but they found in his journal that he kept this poem. And this poem, of course, was published and read aloud and meant so much to everybody that it started this wearing of the poppy. So let's go ahead and read it. I'll read it with you. I read it in poli-sci today too. I usually read it on every Veterans Day. But here we go. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from falling hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. See, the thing is, on those fields, that picture I showed you, let's go back to that battlefield so you can see it. The only thing that grew right away after the fighting stopped were poppies, and they were everywhere. Poppies made it through. And as they were literally carving out cemeteries to lay the valiant dead to rest on both sides, there were poppies, even in Flanders fields, as you see right here. So that becomes kind of an important reminder Now, the thing is, 1 out of every 28 people in France died. France suffered the most in Western Europe. Russia actually suffered more. 1 out of every 32 Germans died. 1 out of every 57 Englishmen died. Americans, we were only in the war for 6 months roughly. We lost over 50,000 men in combat, but we also lost 63,000 from disease, mostly Spanish flu, the pandemic. Right. So we had another 206,000 wounded, right? So this was a massive slaughter. And for me, the day is important. Veterans Day is important to remember because I had a dad, we'll go through this really quick, who fought at the Battle of the Bulge. It was the biggest battle America fought in World War II against the Germans in the middle of winter, against tremendous attack by the last major attack by the Germans against anybody. And then my brother-in-law, who's both have passed away, of course, he fought at the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. He talks about this. They were parachuted in. He found himself behind enemy lines for almost a month and barely made it out. He only knows of one other person in his group of 30 that made it out. It was one of those moments. I, of course, have a son that was in the Air Force. So it means a lot to me today. And my place that I like to go and see every Veterans Day is my favorite memorial to this war. And you see them all over the place, war memorials. But this one's my favorite. It's a sculpture that was done by Cyrus Dallin, who's a famous Utah sculptor. And in the French fashion, he carved this beautiful statue, not very big, but they put it on top of a fountain. And the fountain, of course, it's really pretty, small, but pretty. And all around it, they put the names of the 7 soldiers from Springville and Mapleton that died in the Great War. And they did have 7 trees planted around that fountain. Of course, they're all gone now. I mean, that was a long time ago. But they've remodeled it and they put a nice thing of trees around it. It's down by the splash pad. If you're ever in Springville, go to the city building to the splash pad and you can walk through it and take a few minutes. But it reminds me of what we owe our veterans. We owe them so much. And this is worldwide, right? I'm just giving you a world history story here, the poppies and how people reacted to this great war. But one thing that happens, especially in World War I, we saw it, it was called shell shock, where you're constantly under bombardment, sometimes up to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 days. And you don't know if the next shell is going to hit not just your part of the trench, but they would dig deep in underground and build bunkers underneath to protect themselves even further. But a direct hit and you were history, and some soldiers couldn't take it, the constant pounding, being in that claustrophobic condition, and they just lost it. They would crumble up almost like children and start to rock and scream, and they literally had to be taken out. They had different reactions, but the most extreme reaction was that one. And they would literally have to lift them out, take them to hospital, and send them home. They were no longer able to fight. And it's called shell shock. And many people never got over it. We saw this happen in the Civil War. And the Civil War, my favorite term for this is called soldier's heart, where you're fighting in these terrible conditions. Remember, the Civil War was the first true mechanized war. We had artillery with Napoleon, but we didn't have rifles that could shoot 200 yards. We basically, the whole way we fight changed in the Civil War and World War I. Point is, they called this terrible situation soldier's heart, because your heart's literally broken from everything that happened. Well, the thing is, this is called PTSD today, post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's can lead to all sorts of things, depression or even worse. And so with our veterans, watch them, be careful with them when they come back. Raise your hand if you know somebody that's been in the military, served in the military. Raise your hands. See, look how many hands go up. And most come back just fine, no worries, but sometimes it's pretty rough. And so we have to be understanding. Here's what to look for: persistent, frightening thoughts and memories of their ordeal, right? I mean, they just can't shake it, right? Some can, some can't. Feel emotionally numb, especially when people they were once close to, just unable to connect directly to people that they've been close to in the past. Sleep problems. This is what my dad, my brother-in-law, my dad would wake up in the middle of the night fighting, going through a situation. And my mom would have to get out of the way and then try to gradually wake him up and get him to calm down and that went on for years. The feeling of being detached. And then our Vietnam vets had a lot of this where they came back, and because of the nature of that war, they'd hear a sound like maybe a car backfiring or a firework going off, or somebody might be hunting in the mountains and they hear a shot, and they just freeze and go, just you know. So these are the kinds of things that are the hidden costs of war. And we need to provide not just physical treatment for our soldiers, but also emotional treatment to help them get back and get connected, and if they've gone through traumatic stress. So watch for that and care for them as best you can. And again, today is the day to honor them and their service and their sacrifice, which I choose to do. And today, and what is the day that I ask all my classes to join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, you don't have to if you have a religious objection, or if you have another objection to saying the pledge, that's fine. It's your First Amendment right to sit it out. You don't have to. Nobody's going to force you or think bad of you if you don't. But if you're like me, I think the pledge is kind of a cool thing, especially on a day like today. And if you'll join me, let's say the pledge. You ready? Okay, so there's the flag over there on the side. And if you're willing to join in. And let's do this thing. Okay, ready? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thanks. I appreciate that. So that's a little bit of an insight into world history. World War I, World War II. These were world wars for a reason. We fought actually 7 world wars, if we really actually kept track. And what's a world war? Where superpowers suck in all these other countries into the conflict, and we fight it on multiple continents. It's not a regional war. It takes place all over the planet. And there's been 7 of them. The French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War in 1754. We have another one, the American Revolution turned into a war between France and England. The Dutch, the Spanish, and the Americans and the British fought all over the planet. That was the second one. And then we have, of course, the wars that we fought with Napoleon. So there was the first phase, the French Revolution, and then there was the Napoleonic phase. So there's 4. And then we have 5 with World War I, 6 with World War II. And then you could really say the Cold War could be that 7th war, if you're counting like an historian. Yeah, some people, do that. But those are the ones that are major enough that were fought all over by everybody. Okay, well, let's now take a quick look at change topics here and talk about the election. Mr. Biden's lead is growing. He now leads by 5 million plus votes. He's 50.8% of the vote in the popular vote to Mr. Trump's 47.4. So the election's been over for a while, although Mr. Trump has not conceded yet. He hasn't come out and said, yeah, Biden won. But we do have 3 states that haven't been counted completely yet, which could make Biden's numbers go even further. The reason it keeps growing, in fact, it grew 200,000 between 9 o'clock and your class, more of a gap. And it could go to 6 million. It's the most votes ever won by a presidential candidate. But we still have some other states. So the Electoral College vote as it stands right now is 279. You only need 270 to win. Biden wins. He won fair and square in the Electoral College. There's been no cheating going on. There's no shenanigans. This has been one of the cleanest elections anybody can ever remember. Now in North Carolina, Biden is catching up, but it doesn't look like he's going to get quite up to the lead. So Mr. Trump will win that, about 15 or 16 electoral votes. Georgia, though, Biden's lead keeps growing by the day, but they already started a recount. So they're going to recount the whole state. So who knows how long it'll be before we actually find that number, but that's about 15 electoral votes. 11 electoral votes in Arizona. Mr. Biden is in the lead, but that lead is shrinking as they have still about 1%. In all these states, only about 1% left to count. Alaska now was called this morning. So we had 4 yesterday, we have 3 now. The popular vote lead will keep growing though, because they're still counting votes in some of these other states. California, I think they're only 80% done, but it's already so overwhelming for Biden that they can call a stage. No way President Trump can have a chance there, but it could run up the score another 1,000,000 votes. So we won't know the actual outcome for another month or so, and that's normal. It takes the states over a month to certify their election, to make sure it's accurate, and to report it to the Congress. They don't report it to the president, they report it to the Congress. And the Congress on January 3rd will go through all of those and determine the winner. So we don't, we just know that Biden's going to win. We projected that because the math, it's just math. Does Mr. Trump have enough votes in Georgia to catch up? No. Okay, so we pretty much can call Georgia today. Pennsylvania, no way. Mr. Trump lost it. So that's kind of how it goes. Here is the most votes ever cast for president winner. Exact count pending. The second highest was for President Trump, 1 and 2. The last leader was Obama in 08, and then Obama in 12, and then Hillary Clinton, who lost to Trump in 16, 65 to 62 million. Mr. Trump will have run twice for president and lost both times in the popular vote, but the first time he wins in the Electoral College. Okay, so that's kind of how that goes. So that's just a rundown of where the election stands today. We're not going to get into the politics of it, but we do know the outcome. One of the things that I want to share with you, though, is that we had a campaign where people were talking an awful lot about wearing masks or not wearing masks. For some reason or another, mask wearing became a political issue, which it never should have been. Unfortunately, President Trump had all these rallies where people often didn't wear masks, became mass spreader events during the middle of this crisis, and we're going through the worst of the crisis right now. So the new president is called President-elect Biden, and he's trying to take some steps to make some changes. I'm trying to find the exact clip, though. Yeah, here's the one I want. So let's go ahead and show you this. This is your future president, who isn't president yet. He has no authority, but he can still send a message and try to get people to do the right thing in the meantime. Okay, so here he is, soon to be President 46, Joseph R. Biden.
I won't be president until January 20th. But my message today is to everyone is this: it doesn't matter who you voted for, whether you stood, where you stood before Election Day.
Okay, I'm going to.
It doesn't matter your party, your point of view. We can save tens of thousands of lives if everyone.
Let me start it over, as I wanted to get you guys the full screen version of this for the people at home. So here we go. He's acknowledging that he won't be president until the 20th of January, but there's things we can do now if we want to pull together. I think this is a very powerful statement, so I want y'all to hear it.
I won't be president until January 20th. But my message today is to everyone is this: it doesn't matter who you voted for, whether you stood, where you stood before Election Day. It doesn't matter your party, your point of view. We can save tens of thousands of lives if everyone would just wear a mask for the next months. Not Democrat or Republican lives, American lives. Maybe it would save the life of a person who stocks the shelf at your local grocery store. Maybe it saves the life of a member of your place of worship. Maybe it saves the lives of one of your children's teachers. Maybe it saves your life. So please, I implore you, wear a mask. Do it for yourself. Do it for your neighbor. A mask is not a political statement, but it is a good way to start pulling the country together. I want to be very clear. The goal of mask wearing is not to make your life less comfortable. It's to take something away from you. It's to give something back to all of us, a normal life. The goal is to get back to normal as fast as possible. And masks are critical in doing that. It won't be forever, but that's how we'll get our nation back up to speed economically. So we can go back to celebrating birthdays and holidays together. So we can attend sporting events together. So we can get back to the lives and connections we shared before the pandemic. It doesn't matter whether or not we always agree with one another. It doesn't matter who you voted for. We are Americans and our country is under threat. And now we're now called to do the same thing that generations of proud Americans have done when faced with a crisis throughout our history. Rise above our differences to defend the strength and the vitality of our nation. You know, that's the character of patriots. That's the character of Americans. We have to do this together. Wearing a mask may seem like a small act. Maybe you think your individual choice won't make any difference. But throughout our history, throughout the history of our nation, we've seen over and over how small acts add up to enormous achievements. It's the weight of many small acts together that bend the arc of history. You know, I know there's nothing the American people can't accomplish when we work together as one people with one mission. We can get this virus under control, I promise you. We can rebuild our economy back better than it was before. We can address race-based disparities that damage our country. It's in our power. So let's wear a mask. Let's get to work. Thank you. May God bless you. And for all those who've lost somebody, our heart goes out to you. We know what it's like. Our heart goes out to you.
Wow. So there you go. And I'm going to try to rewind that so we have
Is this
next hour. But that's what leadership looks like in a pandemic. And listen, let's go through some of this. Let's talk about how important this is for a second. I'm going to jump ahead. When it comes to important events in American history and world history, remember, this is a world event, right? This is happening all over the world. We just aren't doing very well with it as a country. Other countries doing much better. The countries in Asia are doing the best with it. And that's where it started. And yet their infection rate is really low. They're mask wearing cultures so that, you know, but this little virus right here, let's look at the big events in American history. And you're living through one of them. And I want you to understand that this is your Pearl Harbor. This is your 9/11. And you may think, oh, you know, wearing a mask, I don't feel sick. 50% of the people, 40 to 50, who have it and are spreading it don't even know they have it. They show no symptoms. And yet it gets to those that will be affected by it. And so we have to wear the mask as an act of patriotism, of course, but also as an act of compassion for people we don't even know. And even if you're never sick or never get the virus, it's important to stop the spread. Our hospitals are getting crammed right now. In Utah, we're under an emergency order right now to wear masks everywhere and keep our numbers down to 10 per any sort of event. And also, right, we canceled all student activities after school and so on. At regular schools, they have a lot more activities than we do. But this is just to keep people safe. Let's take a look at this. The Civil War took from us about 618 to 700,000 people, somewhere in that range. The Great Pandemic 100 years ago, 1919, took 675,000. World War II, 410,000, or excuse me, 18. And then COVID's already catching up in 9 months. This could pass World War II if we're not careful. It's twice as much as World War I and 3 times more than Vietnam. And these are the biggest events. 9/11, less than 3,000 people on 9/11. This is a bigger deal. You go back to World War II, World War I, people were planting gardens. Why? Because all the food had to go to the troops. So people were growing food so we'd have more food here so we didn't have to tax the food supply. They rationed everything. They had ration books. People couldn't get sugar. They couldn't get toilet paper. They couldn't get this, couldn't get that, because we had to take those things and build it into the food supply for the armies fighting the wars. People had to sacrifice. Even though no bombs landed on the United States, people still had to sacrifice. In the Civil War, women in the North and the South both would be at night making bandages for the troops, you know, doing all that. We had lots of people in World War One, when the Great Pandemic hit, rather, making masks because they didn't have the surgical kinds of stuff and the capacity of industry to make a million masks a day. They had to do it by hand. We had family down the street early on. We couldn't get masks, right? They made masks. And they put them out for everybody in the whole neighborhood. These are the little acts that we need to do because we don't want this to get any worse. And we've got a president who can't take charge until the 20th of January, according to our Constitution. So it's a period of where one president is going, but he's doesn't seem to be engaged in this at all. He hasn't had a national security briefing since October 1st. He seems to be out playing golf right now when he should be attending meetings on coronavirus, and he's not doing it. And so he's checked out at a time when we need leadership the most. So I appreciate future President Biden coming out and at least telling us what we should be doing. And he's asking every governor to do their part and every city and county official to do their part. And here's Utah, right? We have to protect our hospitals. Our staff's overworked. There's not enough beds. Some states, they've run out of beds completely and have to build military style field hospitals just to keep going. Texas is in the worst situation it's ever been in. The United States as a whole is losing the battle here. And so that's why the emergency order from our governor, and all of us just need to do our part. And if we do, all of us do it. 95% of people wear masks. This thing would start to wind down in a hurry. The vaccine itself, there's some good news on the vaccine. Future President Trump, future President Biden, let me get that right. President-elect Biden has already picked the chairs of the new coronavirus task force. One was a former Surgeon General. The other was a head of the FDA who has to approve all vaccines to make sure they're safe and effective. And so he's already got a team in place, 18 people. They're already out canvassing the country, trying to get people to do the right thing. And the office of the president-elect is now providing leadership on the most important issue of our time. We can't get back to normal until we get this virus under control. And even with this vaccine, it's a 2-shot vaccine, has to be stored at 100 degrees below zero. It's going to be very hard to distribute. There's only going to be a few 50, 60,000 at first that will go to first, hospital workers and that kind of thing. It might be midsummer before there's enough for all of us. And what about the people all over the world? So we're going to rejoin the World Health Organization, which the current president pulled us out of for some reason. We're going to join that again on the 20th of January. And we're going to take this on a worldwide basis, because if we can stop it around the world, we can stop it from coming here, right? That's now, do you realize Americans can't travel to Europe and can't go to Canada? We're blocked because we have more virus than they do, and they're not going to let us in. So you can't travel to Europe right now as an American. A lot of Americans had this mask wearing thing wrong. Let's just be honest. Here's the deal. It's an important deal. Even with the vaccine, we're probably going to be wearing masks for another year or more. We just got to get used to it, like they are in Japan, like they are in Korea, like they are in China. That's why they're not having the troubles we're having, because they get it down the virus to just a few, and then they can contact trace and make sure it doesn't spread. So they stop the little clusters so life can go on as normal. We could be in that place too if we'd all decided to wear masks back in March. But it became a political issue, which it never should have been. We have a Declaration of Independence, which, by the way, is one of the great documents, not just in American history, but world history. We talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A lot of people want to pursue the happiness, and they don't want to wear masks because it'll offend their liberty, but they forgot that the first number in that list, number 1, is life. We start by protecting people's lives. Then we can pursue freedom and happiness, but we've got to protect people's lives first. It's a prerequisite to freedom and pursuit of happiness. So you guys are doing your part. I see it every day. You're helping to save my life, my mom's life, who was a World War II hero, 98 years old. We can't get her around any young people that might be contagious. She won't make it. So do your part for the generation that made your lives possible, made my life possible. And it's a simple act, but it is like World War II. People here at home, they weren't under fire, but they were in the war. They went to work in the war industry. They conserved certain products so we could get them to our troops. They grew victory gardens. They did fundraisers. They raised money for the war effort, and they did these drives, these scrap drives for metal and for rubber, which was very short supply in those days, and all this kind of stuff to win the war. Win the war. Make the decision. Win the war. It's a big deal. And it's a world event. And as we, of course, teach you in world history, there's a lot uh, of these kinds of things that happen. You know, that one that hit Athens, right? That plague that took 50% of the population. They would hit Rome now and again too. Rome had some interesting times with this kind of stuff. And then the worst was in 1300s. Europe got hit with the Black Plague, and they didn't understand mask wearing. They didn't have hospitals. They didn't have oxygen tanks. They didn't have, all of the, respirators. They didn't have the drugs we've got to mitigate. Luckily, this is not going to be as bad as 1918, 1919. You know why? Because we know what to do if we'll just do it. And so everybody knew that the fall would be worse than the spring. Everybody knew it. But instead it turned in, oh no, we're rounding the corner. It's not really, we're not rounding the corner. When the weather gets cold, this thing takes off because people are crammed indoors. We knew this was going to happen. And yet we didn't have the leadership to prepare. Now we do. And so I really appreciate President-elect Biden, taking charge at this critical moment. All right, well, let's now talk about the rise of Christianity. Look, there have been certain religious movements through ancient and classical period of history that really changed the ethics and values of the world. It's a period called the Aeschyl period. It starts about 500 BCE. You see it in Greece. Greece had these weird gods doing weird things. They, as far as teaching ethics and values, that's not what these gods were good at. They were good at throwing lightning bolts and causing trouble. But you remember what the Greeks did. They invented philosophy. While not a religion, it does teach you a certain degree of ethics. Remember the skeptics and Diogenes and all that? The Romans, of course, had stoicism. But this teaches a different kind of value, right? How to honor other people and how you should act. Think through it. Now, on a religious side, though, we had the rise of Buddha. We had some fundamental changes in Hinduism that made it much more people-oriented, more of the love thy neighbor as thyself, as opposed to an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth that you would have seen, of course, in the ancient world. And this is happening all over. And then at the middle of this period, which lasts about 1,000 years, you have Christianity developing. You also have some big changes in the way Judaism is practicing its religion. And then, of course, the next step is the rise of Muhammad and Islam. All of these are compassion-oriented religions to help people be better. Now, the deal is Christianity would catch on during Pax Romana. It was a time in Rome where Rome was looking for something else. I mean, let's be honest, Jupiter, Mars, I mean, come on, these gods are they're not worth worshiping. They aren't. You go back and you think about what they were saying and everything, they were disillusioned. So people were looking for new religion in Rome. One of the big cults came out of Egypt. And in Egypt, right, they had the cult of Osiris, and they were trying to make that, something important. There was a group of people, Romans, that were adopting the old Egyptian religion. And then there was Mithra. Mithra, of course, would come out of Persia. Persia had a monotheistic kind of religion under Zarathustra, and he has to be one of these people in this Aeschyl period that's really important. Zarathustra, boy, he's very influential. Ahura Mazda was the name of the god, and the god of fire, and he was one god, a monotheistic kind of person. That could have easily been the dominant religion in the world today had it not been for Thermopylae and Salamis and that. But at any rate, what we're saying is there are religions now coming on board the world's history that are changing the way people think and interact with each other. And one of those very important ones, obviously, is Christianity. With Pax Romana, it meant that Christians could travel throughout the Mediterranean world safely and have little communities all over. And this religion of this poor carpenter who sacrificed his life for humanity in this religious theology really caught on among the plebeians and slaves. because they said there's an afterlife, and if you're a good person in this life, you'll be rewarded in heaven. So at a time when your life isn't all that great and there's not a lot to look forward to in some ways, I mean, of course, they were happy people. I'm over exaggerating here a little bit. But by the same token, this is very, very attractive. Plus, the early Christians were really good at sharing, they were very communal. Some people, object to this because it was socialism where they shared things in common and all that kind of stuff. And then this is utopianism. It happened. It's what they did. But it brought people in who were poor and disadvantaged, and the church would feed them. It was feed, everybody. I mean, like the loaves and the fishes. Remember that story if you're familiar with the Christian Bible at all? On the mount where there's this huge crowd and they get fed. Feeding your neighbor, taking care of those who are poor and hungry. That became a big part of Christianity. And it meant that a lot of poor and disadvantaged people were brought into this religion. So it was small at first, extremely small. It was only a little small break off of a much larger Judaism that had, hundreds of thousands of people in it. But it was able to grow slowly in the Roman Empire. Now, here's the catch. Roman religion was a civic duty. To go worship the patron gods of your city and also the Roman gods, and maybe even the current emperor, was an act of patriotism. Oh, yeah. It's like saying the Pledge of Allegiance and paying your taxes. Because if you go to the temple, you bring an offering. Well, that offering is used to sustain the temple, to sustain the people that take care of it, to keep it going. So basically, if you didn't go and worship the Roman gods, now they let you worship any god you want. You can be any religion you want, but on Roman holidays, go to this temple and make an offering to Jupiter, or make an offering to Caesar, or make an offering to Augustus. It was the law. They would offer sacrifices, usually plants and animals, and those animals, of course, would be eaten and used. And they had the whole bunch of festivals and holidays on the calendar. So you knew when this calendar came up, you needed to do these things to be a true Roman citizen. You could practice your own religion too on the side, but you had to do this too. Christians, of course, are going to object to that. So did the Jews. So this is going to cause some frictions, obviously. But basically, you have to understand, in those times, magic and religion were kind of the same. The idea of putting fruit out and it desiccates and whatever and goes up to heaven. But they also had, people who could do little magic tricks and whatever. And it's different than today. Under the pagans, magic bleeds over a little bit. And that's what these new religions kind of broke away from, is the magic part, is more of the spiritual part. So we're seeing a big change in the way people are feeling about religion. All right, getting away from the magic side. Now, the deification, this is an important term. It means to make a person a god who isn't one. Here's the pantheon from the inside. We showed you that the other day, right? Alexander the Great was deified because the Persian leaders were, the Egyptian leaders were. They were turned into gods that you couldn't approach. You couldn't go up to the Persian leader unless you were totally on the ground crawling forward. If your shadow crossed his, it was a death penalty offense, because they wanted to create this aura of awe that you couldn't challenge it. You couldn't challenge the pharaohs because they were your gateway to heaven and they were gods. So Alexander tried to play on that in order to keep the population, loyal to him. Augustus, Caesar, same thing. Right? So the emperor became a divine spirit, if you will. And so you'd sacrifice to the emperor. One of the holidays was the sacrifice to whoever the current emperor was. And it's also kind of, remember this, it's a form of taxation, right? So there's more to it than that. Still, Rome, as pagans, had in the early period, they had virtue. I mean, I'm not saying they didn't lack ethics or values. They did have them. They believed in courage. They believed in honor and frugality. Don't waste things. Good stuff. Stoicism emerged from that. So I'm not saying they're bad people. I'm just saying they're looking at things differently than we do by a lot. I mean, it's like, completely different. All right. Now, when we talk about philosophy, there's several phases here that we need to talk about. Okay, the aristocratic view among the patricians was that myths existed for the sake of bringing morality to the masses. These were stories that the rich, powerful people kept repeating so the masses would follow that way of life. Myth is power. And if you can teach a mythology, you can keep people more or less in their place. Now, Neoplatonism mixed ideas of Plato with mystical interpretations of the nature of good and natural world and the human soul. So now we have a mixture of philosophy and guess what? Good old magic. Interesting, right? I mean, how many movies do we have today that talk about this time period? You know, Merlin the magician and all that kind of stuff. Syncretism is this mixing together different religious ideas in synchrony. So you take some ideas from some religion, one idea to the other, and create something new. All this was happening in Rome, all at the same time. And along comes Christianity. Right. Now, Jesus and a handful, in the company of a handful of a few philosophers, religious leaders, the 12 apostles and some others, bishops and so on, religiously in the world history, look, he changed the arc of the moral universe, as did some others with his followers. I'm talking about the apostles and others who spread his word, included Muhammad, Buddha, Confucius, and Zarathustra. That's a pretty impressive list. And remember, there's also changes going on in Judaism and in Hinduism. And it all kind of happened all at once, all over the world, seemingly not with any real organization to it. It wasn't like one borrowed from the other. They just kind of happened. So we're talking about Jesus, Buddha, Confucius in China, Zarathustra in Persia, and Muhammad in Arabia that are literally going to change the moral arc of the universe. And as an added result, keep Rome together for a little bit longer. All right, so let's stop right there. I think it's a beautiful place to stop, to be honest. So let's see you guys next lecture, and we'll finish the story of Christianity's rise in the Roman Empire.